So how do I learn about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, part of this is a really good question, and it's a very fair question. Everyone should ask of any food that they eat, not just vegan food
Yeah.
in general, right? So the first part I want to say there is people should first start questioning what they're currently eating, even before they switch to a plant-based diet. They should get a sense of what is the current state of things that they're eating. What does that come from? What is it that their animal products are made of? What kind of, say, hormones or antibiotics and stuff go in there? So just one small like number there is that about 80% of all antibiotics used in the United States as a whole by anybody, humans or animals, 80% of that is actually used on animals, right? So the runoff of that into the fields, and everyone wants to talk about antibiotic resistance, but very few people dig in lower to look at the actual biggest cause behind antibiotic resistance developing, right? So that's like just one of the things to
So,
mention.
sorry, what do you mean by the antibiotic resistance? What do you mean by that?
So antibiotic resistance, as in animals or humans, when we consume antibiotics, they eventually run off through into the water system through our waste that comes out of our bodies, and stuff that even just get dumped that's not used, for example. And like your prescription, you might not use something, like you dump it out in the garbage or like flush it on the toilet or whatever, right? This stuff doesn't just disappear. This stuff really goes out, runs into our water streams, gets into agricultural land, goes all around where other animals, insects, microorganisms, they feed on this stuff essentially, this toxic, mix of these sort of chemicals and antibiotics, which now has over time caused a problem that these very things that we wanted to be resistant from, certain germs, certain infections, certain diseases, certain types of insects, now start getting completely resistant to certain antibiotics. So we were taking antibiotics to prevent ourselves from certain kind of threats to our body, but these very threats are now just getting in small doses around the world, getting used to it essentially. So they're becoming immune to antibiotics, and that's the reason why antibiotic resistance is a global concern. Even in India, for example, 70% of antibiotics are consumed by animals. So the idea is that people are worried about the development of a superbug in the future, which is already on the way. They're already seeing huge changes and strides to the point where antibiotics will be useless at a certain point going forward. And to think that a large part of it is happening because of what's going on your plate, I think is an important thing to really consider, amongst other things as well. So that's one part of it, right? But other than that, people talk about like, where do I get my protein from, for example, right? Like, and a lot of people don't realize that the building blocks of proteins, which are amino acids, the only place where amino acids are manufactured on this planet is inside plants. Naturally, that's the only place that they're manufactured. And most of the animals that we consume these plants in order to take these amino acids and building blocks and synthesize these very same proteins inside them, essentially. So to say that you can't get your protein from animals is quite a bit of a fallacy. It's just a lot of lack of information and misinformation that's been spread around. Um, there's talk around like, hey, there's like these essential amino acids that humans need for bodybuilding and for muscle building and to be an athlete. I don't want to just be like a thin, weak person who's like environmentally driven by animal welfare. But then you have the leading most athletes in the world, right from the NBA to the NFL to Formula One to Olympic champions. The only male to represent the U.S. U.S. weightlifting team in the last Olympics, for example, was plant-based completely. So if you tell me you can't get enough protein from these things, I would really ask people to go back to the drawing board, learn a little bit more about where protein comes from, and also to allude to the chemicals aspect that you mentioned. There are products out there in the plant-based world that are not good for you, right? So, for example, I'm not recommending you sit and eat potato chips all day, right? Potato chips are also vegan, but they're fried and they have a lot of other things which you shouldn't consume too much of. Like, just like in the non-plant-based world or the animal-based product world, there are products with a lot of things that you shouldn't be eating. It is similar. There are bad things in the plant-based world, but the processing that we're talking about with these meats and the meat alternatives that we're referring to are processes that aren't actually as evil as they talk about. These are like similar to how my mom takes like wheat flour at home, or like wheat at home, or like basic ingredients, dries them, pulverizes them, stores them overnight, marinates them, make certain like shapes out of them or something like which realigns the proteins in there. It's just that we are not used to taking everyday cooking in our lives, realizing what is the scientific term for the process, and then sort of starting to think that sort of the industrial scale processes are certainly painted in that light. A lot of it is also about lobbying, where there's a lot of people who stand to lose a lot from lesser animal products being consumed.
Fair.
So there's a ton of information also being spread out. So again, don't get me wrong, it's not all holy and green and all great in the alternative protein world. But yes, not all of it is bad. A lot of it is actually way better for you. There is no cholesterol in any of this food, for example. There are no carcinogens in this food, for example. So I think that should get people thinking a little more about what they're eating.